shortly after the discovery of the horribly mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square, Alfred Long, a Metropolitan Police constable on his beat in Goulston Street, discovered a significant piece of evidence. This was a torn piece of fabric covered in blood and feces. It was later determined that this had been ripped from the apron worn by the killer's second victim that night. No one can now deny that this was a crucial piece of evidence. It had to have been taken from the scene by the perpetrator. It had to have been discarded by him, and it undoubtedly informed investigators he had headed back into Whitechapel, where he was most probably living. After killing 2 women within an hour of one another, we can safely assume he was making his way home. Nowhere in the East End would have been safe for him, with the police constables of 2 London police forces now searching every street, lane and alley for any sign of him. But in the doorway of 106 to 119 Wentworth model dwellings on Goulston Street, where the blood-soaked piece of apron was found, there was another piece of evidence. On the brickwork of the entrance above the bloody piece of apron, someone had scrawled some words in chalk. The Juwes are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. This text, which at the time was thought to have been the work of the Ripper, was potentially explosive. Since the Nichols murder, there was a growing popular sentiment that a Jew must have been behind these crimes, as the newspapers had already opined, an Englishman could not have committed such outrages. On the night after the murder of Annie Chapman, there were crowds on the street around Hanbury Street shouting anti-Jewish racist slogans, and regardless of his elimination from the inquiry, the fact that John Pizer, known as Leather Apron, was a Jew continued to fuel racial tensions around the murders. Moreover, Goulston Street, where the graffiti was discovered, was populated by a great many Jewish immigrants from Russia and Eastern Europe. Having such a statement scribbled above what was most certainly a piece of evidence discarded by the Ripper made the graffiti guilty by association. And implicating the Jewish community further in these murders might well have had catastrophic consequences. Obviously then the police were going to be very cautious in their handling of this item. Perhaps too cautious, and the decision to have it wiped from the wall remains one of the most controversial policing decisions of the Ripper case. Not long after its discovery, H Division Police Superintendent Thomas Arnold came to the scene to see the writing for himself and was rather nervous that it might be the cause of an anti-Jewish riot. The decision was made to cover it for the time being, while details were sent to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Charles Warren. Yet in the meantime, there was a brewing stramash between the city and the Metropolitan Police forces. The bloody apron was found in Metropolitan territory, but the victim had been killed in the City of London, meaning the 2 police forces were investigating the same crime. It was the desire of the city police to have this writing photographed, which would be standard in a modern investigation, but in 1888 crime scene photography was not the norm. As Goulston Street was within the policing area of the Metropolitan Force, any final decision would be in Warren's hands. With Thomas Arnold on the scene and the city police there waiting the arrival of a photographer, Charles Warren, the Commissioner, turned up in person. Arnold had a constable standing at the ready by the doorway with a sponge and a bucket to wipe away the graffiti once it had been photographed. But Warren had other ideas. Agreeing that it would likely spark a riot, he ordered it washed off immediately. His order was duly obeyed. This was about 5:30 in the morning. Was this the right decision? From a modern viewpoint, no. This was an atrocious decision. But we must judge the past by the standards of the time. Warren was particularly sensitive to the feelings of the Jewish immigrant community in the East End. Between 1867 and 1870, he led the Palestine Expeditionary Fund's archaeological survey of Jerusalem. He was an old-school Anglican Christian Zionist who believed in the resettlement of the Jewish people in Palestine, and had a somewhat romanticised, if patronising, understanding of the Jews as God's people and his own role as a servant of the British Empire, as an agent in Jewish fortunes. He was willing to take the heat, and he ordered it removed. But was this really an anti-Jewish text? Stephen Knight, the British journalist and the author of The Brotherhood and Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, did not think so. According to him, the Juwes was a reference to three characters from Freemasonic lore: Jubilah, Jubilo, and Jubilum, the ruffians, the fellow craft masons who conspired against Hiram Abiff, the architect of Solomon's Temple. What makes this all the juicier is the fact that Charles Warren himself was a Freemason, a brother who served as worshipful master of the Royal Lodge of Friendship in Gibraltar. He was the founding worshipful master of the famous Quator Coronati Lodge, and he was later to become Grand Deacon of the United Grand Lodge of England and District Grand Master of the Eastern Archipelago in Singapore. By any measure, Brother Warren was no mere master in the blue or a fellow on the square. He was one of the highest ranking Freemasons of the ancient free and accepted order of Freemasons in the British Empire. But here's the rub. There is not a single provincial constitution of Freemasonry in the English, Scots or Irish rights in which the ruffians are known as the Juwes. This term would have been unfamiliar to a Freemason until 1976, when Knight published his very anti-Masonic conspiracy theory. In very good humour these days, the term is familiar to every practising Freemason. Sure, every octogenarian in his best bib and tucker under his lodge regalia loves to be associated with the myth of Saucy Jack. This was, of course, a massive reach and a complete fabrication by Stephen Knight. But he knew that. He was all about the selling of the books, and he certainly achieved this. The downside, however, is that this nonsense merely shifted the gaze of prejudice from Jews to Freemasons. It was no secret Charles Warren was a senior Freemason. He was not alone in the British police. In fact, this is still a very popular pastime in the British police today. He was not the only Freemason in the police at the time, and he was not the only Mason at the scene. Members of the city police were Masons too, and yet they had no issue with wanting this graffito photographed. The reason for this is quite simple. This was not a Masonic code, and if it was, it would not have been understood by people who had not been initiated into the most sublime third degree of the Masonic ritual. But this made for a good story. The most likely truth of this graffito is quite uninteresting and pedestrian. As we see daily on social media today, most people have only the most basic grasp of correct grammar and spelling. This misspelling of Jews is a fairly good attempt by anyone thinking phonetically. It was the work of a semi-literate racist writing something offensive on the wall in an area inhabited by a good number of Jewish families. Sadly, this is a common feature of London and cities like it even today. But was this the work of the man who killed and butchered Catherine Eddowes, and who tore a piece of her apron off and dropped it in the doorway? The answer is that it could have been, but it is highly unlikely. Racist graffiti happens. Recently, in New York City, a Jewish man was arrested for spray painting a swastika on his own home and reporting it to the police as a hate crime. Racist graffiti is that ubiquitous. It is serious and it is disturbing, but it is common. It was just as common in London in 1888. The man who murdered and mutilated Catherine Eddowes was escaping the scene. He took a piece of apron because he needed to wipe blood from his hands. He was going to considerable lengths to evade detection and capture. So the idea of him stopping to write a cryptic racist message on a wall where any number of people could have seen him is quite preposterous. In all likelihood, the graffito was already on the wall when the Ripper ran past and threw the bloody scrap of apron in the doorway. But, as is always the case, such curious evidence makes for a fantastic story. But my own suspicion is that is all that it is. A good story with little or no foundation in the facts.